Hello everybody, and welcome back to Nerdy Miniatures. In today's video, we paint yet another Warhammer exclusive. In today's video, we paint the defenders of Lake Town, which consists of Bard the Bowman, Tauriel the Elf, and Legolas the Prince of the Woodland Realm. So, without further ado, let's get into the video. Let's talk about Bard. Now, Bard was very easy to build. Consisting of only a few pieces, he went together in little to no time at all. Before painting him, I sprayed Bard with one coat of grey Seer spray paint and left him to dry for 15 minutes before beginning the paint. I started with a coat of Guilliman Flesh, leaving it to dry before moving on to Bard's tunic. Using the shade Gorthor Brown, I swept a light coat over the tunic before moving on to his coat. Bard's entire outfit consists of a lot of brown tones, so it was important to add depth and highlights where I could, using only these shades. Using a medium-sized brush, I dipped into the shade Dryad Bark and began to sweep it across the coat, leaving the underside plain as it is lined with fur. I applied the same shade to Bard's head, giving him dark brown locks. Once that was dry, I began to add some dimension and warmth to the figure. To do this, I dipped my dry brush into Mournfang Brown, brushing off most of the excess onto a piece of kitchen paper before sweeping it over the coat. It adds such a subtle bit of warmth and dimension, but I think it ended up being one of my favourite parts of this figure. Using that same shade, I painted the bow and his quiver. Once that was dry, I moved on to painting the furs. For this, I used Bane-Blade Brown and a small brush. I swept it over the underside of the coat, around the edges and seams, and where the furs poked through. Whilst the furs dried, I moved on to Bard's boots. Dipping back into Dryad Bark, I swept it across his boots, creating the perfect dark brown leather, fitting for any pair of sturdy winter boots. Now, despite the cold weather in Lake Town, Bard still needed to look like he'd seen a little bit of sun in his life. So to warm up his skin and give the semblance of sunshine, I used Cadian Fleshtone and Kislev Flesh to make Bard appear a little livelier than before. Off screen, I applied white to his eyes and I used the shade Eshin Grey for his pupils to create a slightly lighter look to his face. I also applied Dryad Bark to his chin and a small amount to his top lip to create the effect of facial hair before giving him eyebrows. With Bard's body done, I moved on to his base. For this, I used Stirland Mud. Moving on to Tauriel, our she-elf from Mirkwood. Building Tauriel was a tad bit trickier than building Bard, as she had a few more parts than Bard and she was slightly trickier to build, as her pieces were more delicate and intricate. But the one thing I did like is they gave me options when it came to her weapons. Like most elves, Tauriel is very skilled with the bow, but she is also very skilled with swords and knives. So with that in mind, I had the option of giving Tauriel a bow and a knife, or two knives. In the end, I did decide to give her both weapons rather than just the knives. Despite being fiddly, in the end she looked pretty good and primed and ready for battle. Now moving on to painting. Once again, I based her in grey before applying a small layer of Guilliman Flesh to her skin. Moving on to her legs and tunic, her legs seem to be a slightly bluer shade of green, so to attempt to achieve this, I mixed Waagh Flesh and Sotek Green, which is actually a bluer toned green, so I mixed these in a palette and brushed it over the legs before moving on to her tunic. For For this I applied Waagh flesh all over using a small brush. Moving on to her boots and the cuffs around her wrists, for this I used Dryad Bark and used a small brush to apply this. This created the perfect effect of leather. Under all that paint we'd lost some details, so it was time to bring those to life again. For this I used grey Seer and I dry brushed it across the figure. Afterwards it was time to begin the highlights. On the front of the tunic there are some tie details as well as some boning. For this I mixed two colours. I mixed Elysian Green with Bane-Blade Brown to create a lighter earthy brown green colour. I applied this with a small brush. Now moving on to the hair. For her auburn locks I mixed Mournfang Brown and I just a little bit of Mephiston Red, just to add more of a red hint to her locks. Now this was a really good idea because it really made their figure's hair pop. One of my favourite details is the gold on her boots and her cuffs, so to do this I applied a small amount of Retributor Armour. This tiny detail really brought these leather details together. I proceeded to dry brush more Elysian Green over the trousers to properly highlight these from the tunic. As a redhead, for Tauriel's skin I had to make her a little fairer than most. Originally I went in with Cadian Fleshtone and Kislev Flesh, but I found it to be too warm toned, so in the end I went over her skin again with a mix of Kislev Flesh and Rakarth Flesh, which has really cooled down the colour and gave a subtle pink tone to the skin instead. Just like Bard, I went in with white and Eshin Grey off camera for her eyes, and I decided to paint a coat of Guilliman Flesh over the top of her hair to add shine, and I really think this pulled the figure together. Just like Bard, I painted her base using Stirland Mud. Moving on to our last figure, the Prince of Mirkwood, Legolas. Legolas is slightly different from other figures, as he has a prop to stand up on. We know Legolas is notorious for making many masterful shots, and apparently in the world of Warhammer it is no different, as Legolas can be seen leaning off a tree branch after loosing an arrow that I have no doubt would hit its target. But before I could start painting him, I had to fill in some gaps. To do this, I used the product The Green Stuff. This is a very easy product to use. Simply apply it to the gaps from what you want to fill. Then, using a dampened brush, I manipulate the product until I am happy with it. This also removes any excess product. I ended up applying around 3 layers of this in the end, as I would rather do multiple layers and have full control of the product than be sloppy with it and make a mistake. Once I was happy with my final layer, I left it to dry, and after around 20 minutes, I sprayed the figure using grey Seer spray paint and left it to dry for a further 15 minutes. Once that dried, I applied the shade Guilliman Flesh and swept it over his face, neck and hands before moving on to his tunic. Legolas's colour scheme is more or less identical to Tauriel's, so just like I did for her, I went in with the same shade of Waagh Flesh for his tunic. Next came time to do Legolas's wonderful locks, so to do this, I used the shade Zandri Dust and a small brush to make sure each strand was covered. Can't afford to have a single blonde strand out of place. With that dried down, it was time to start adding some depth to his skin, so I went in with a thin layer of Kislev Flesh and a pointy brush, brushing off any excess onto my thumb to ensure I didn't have too much product and risk flooding his features. Next, it was time to add paint to his bow and his quiver. For this, I used Gorthor Brown and a small brush to carefully sweep the colour over the weapons to ensure I didn't get any on his skin or his tunic. Using the same shade, I brushed the first coat of colour onto the branch he was stood on. Moving back onto Legolas himself, it was time to paint his boots and his cuffs. For this, I used Dryad Bark as the base. Just like with Tauriel, I would later go on to add highlights and some gold to really show them off. Now it was time to do the first coat of dry brushing. For this I went in with grey Seer, focusing heavily on the centre of his chest, and brushing the excess of what was left on the brush across the rest of the figure. Once that dried, I went in with a second coat of dry brushing, this time using Elysian Green, and the same brush, focusing mostly on the tree-like swirls and leaf-like armour plates that he had on his chest. We were moving on to a final stretch of the painting now. I filled in Legolas's eyes off camera, and whilst that dried, I painted the second coat of paint onto the tree branch. I did this using Mournfang Brown, and I finished it off using Gore Grunta Fur. Once that was dry, I moved on to his base. Just like the other two, I used Stirland Mud to paint the base, but now they were all dry, it was time to start adding some greenery and foliage to each mini to finish them all off. And that is it. That is our Defenders of Lake Town painted. Hope you guys enjoyed yet another Warhammer exclusive. I know I did. In fact, I liked it so much that on Wednesday we'll be painting another as we paint Celeborn and Galadriel, which will be my first metal figures. So let's see what that entails. Down in the description you'll find 2 links. The first to Mr. Nerd's channel. So if you enjoy MMOs and action RPGs, then feel free to check that out. If you enjoy all things fantasy lore, I cover things like Tolkien, Game of Thrones, Age of Sigmar, and most recently The Witcher. So if that interests you, feel free to check that out also. Anyway, that'll be it from me today. Hope you guys have a wonderful day or night, wherever you are in the world. And as always, peace out.